A little boy knocks on a billionaire's office door asking for a job, saying he wants to buy his poor, hard-working single mom a day off. What the billionaire does next leaves the little boy and his mom in disbelief. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The receptionist at Wolf Enterprises had seen a lot of strange things in her years working at the front desk: investors storming in unannounced, reporters trying to sneak past security, even the occasional ex-girlfriend making a scene. But a 7-year-old boy in a comically oversized suit confidently striding toward her desk was a first. Leo Carter adjusted the sleeves of his ill-fitting blazer, which nearly swallowed his arms whole, and cleared his throat in an exaggeratedly professional manner. "I need to see Mr. Wolf," he announced, placing a slightly crumpled sheet of paper on the counter. "It's business." The receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Carol who had long mastered the art of dismissing people without making a scene, barely spared the boy a glance before returning to her computer. "Sweetheart, Mr. Wolf is very busy. Maybe try writing him a letter?" Leo furrowed his brows, clearly unimpressed with this suggestion. "Letters take too long," he said matter-of-factly. "I need a job now. It's important." Carol suppressed a chuckle and glanced at the paper he had placed on the counter. It was, to her amusement, a resume, written in crayon, complete with a drawing of what she assumed was Leo himself, standing proudly with a stack of dollar bills. Underneath, he had listed his qualifications: good at math, fast runner, very strong, and knows how to make toast. Just as she was about to gently shoo him away, a deep voice interrupted. "What's going on here?" The entire lobby seemed to still. Harrison Wolf didn't usually make an appearance down here. He preferred to remain in his office, overseeing his empire from above like a king on his throne. But today, for whatever reason, the CEO of Wolf Enterprises had stepped out of the elevator just in time to witness a very small boy attempting to negotiate his way into a job. Carol hesitated, not entirely sure how to explain this. But before she could, Leo took matters into his own hands. "You must be Mr. Wolf," he said, tilting his head up to take in the tall, intimidating man in a tailored charcoal suit. "Good. I was just asking for a meeting with you." A slow, incredulous smirk crossed Harrison's face. "Were you now?" Leo nodded, completely unfazed by the billionaire's imposing presence. "Yep. I need a job." The few employees lingering in the lobby subtly turned their heads, pretending not to eavesdrop but very clearly invested in whatever was happening. Harrison, intrigued despite himself, crossed his arms. "And what kind of job are you looking for?" "Something that pays well," Leo answered without hesitation. "My mom works a lot, and she never gets a break. I want to earn enough money to give her a day off." For the first time, Harrison actually looked at the boy, really looked at him. The oversized blazer, the scuffed sneakers peeking out from beneath the too long pants, the determined set of his small jaw. There was no trace of hesitation in his eyes, no expectation of pity, just pure determination, as if he had every right to be here. The logical thing would be to dismiss him. Harrison Wolf didn't hire children, obviously. He had better things to do than entertain whatever game this kid was playing. And yet, against all rational thought, he found himself saying, "Come with me." Carol blinked. The employees loitering nearby exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even Leo seemed momentarily surprised before quickly recovering, puffing out his chest with importance as he followed Harrison toward the private elevator. The ride to the top floor was silent, except for the occasional squeak of Leo's sneakers against the polished marble floor. When they finally reached Harrison's office, the boy let out a low whistle. "Whoa! This is fancy," he observed, wandering over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire city. "You must be really rich. That tends to happen when you run a billion-dollar company," Harrison remarked dryly, lowering himself into the sleek leather chair behind his desk. "So tell me, Leo, why does your mom need a day off?" Leo turned, crossing his arms. "Because she's tired," he said simply. "She works double shifts at the diner, and even when she's home, she's doing stuff." She never stops. I asked her to take a day off before, but she said we couldn't afford it. He lifted his chin. So I figured if I made the money myself, she wouldn't have a choice. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying the boy. This was usually the part where kids, if they even made it this far, would start with the sad eyes, the dramatic pleas for help. But Leo wasn't asking for a handout. He wasn't even asking for charity. He wanted to earn the money. Harrison's assistant, Melanie, peeked her head in, looking beyond confused. Sir, do you need me to call security, or? Harrison waved her off. Not yet. He turned his attention back to Leo. All right. Let's say I do give you a job. What exactly do you think you could do here? Leo pulled out a second crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket and smoothed it out on the desk. I made a list. Harrison glanced at it, brow arching as he read the hastily scribbled words. Help people carry stuff, make sure no one steals anything, give you good ideas. Tell jokes to keep people happy. He huffed out a laugh before he could stop himself. Tell jokes, huh? Yep, Leo said confidently. People work better when they're happy. My mom says so. Harrison tapped his fingers against the desk, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He should send the kid on his way. He should be focusing on his actual work, not entertaining a 7-year-old's business proposal. But there was something undeniably refreshing about Leo, something that tugged at a part of Harrison he didn't even realize was still there. Finally, he leaned forward. All right, Leo. You want a job? You've got one. Leo's eyes widened. Really? Really? Harrison said, already questioning his sanity. But only for the day. Think of it as an internship. Leo beamed. Okay. So what do I do first? Harrison leaned back, amused. Why don't we start by getting you a desk? As Melanie gawked from the doorway and Harrison's employees whispered in shock, Leo Carter officially became the youngest business consultant Wolf Enterprises had ever seen. And though Harrison didn't know it yet, this impulsive decision was about to change everything. Harrison leaned back in his chair, watching with bemusement as Leo paced around the office like a miniature executive preparing for a major acquisition. The kid had taken his one-day internship with the kind of seriousness that would put some of Harrison's actual employees to shame. His crumpled paper resume was now neatly smoothed out on the desk, a pen in his tiny hand as he scribbled something on a fresh sheet. Every now and then, he'd pause, tap the pen against his chin in deep thought, then nod to himself as if confirming an important decision. Melanie, still hovering in the doorway with the expression of someone witnessing an alternate reality, cleared her throat. Sir? Should I actually find him a desk? Harrison smirked, glancing at Leo. The kid was already making himself at home, and something told him that if he didn't assign him a workspace, Leo would simply claim one on his own. He waved a dismissive hand. Sure. Give him a spot. Let's see what our new business consultant can come up with. Leo's face lit up as Melanie led him out of the office, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, Harrison found himself amused by the whole situation. It wasn't every day a 7-year-old barged into his life demanding employment. Most kids were too busy playing video games or whatever it was kids did these days. Yet here was Leo, determined to buy his mother a day off like it was the most logical, natural thing in the world. Half an hour later, Harrison was reviewing reports when his office phone rang. He picked up, still only half paying attention, until he heard the voice on the other end. Mr. Wolf? Melanie's voice sounded wary. You might want to come see this. Harrison frowned. See what? There was a pause, then a sigh. Your new consultant is holding a staff meeting. Harrison blinked. He must have misheard that. He's what? He's got half of marketing, a couple of junior execs, and 2 interns in the break room. I think he's pitching them ideas. I heard something about cookies and spaceships. Harrison was already pushing himself out of his chair. I'll be right there. When he arrived at the break room, the scene that greeted him was nothing short of surreal. Employees, people who usually flinched when Harrison so much as entered a room, were gathered around, listening intently as Leo, standing on a chair, delivered what could only be described as a presentation. So, if we give people cookies, they'll be happier. Leo was explaining enthusiastically, gesturing wildly. And happy people work harder. My mom says so. And if they work harder, that means your company makes more money. There was a murmur of amused agreement among the gathered employees. Someone in the back muttered, "Honestly, he's not wrong." And another thing, Leo continued, your company should sell fun stuff. Not just boring business things. Like, I dunno, spaceships. A chuckle rippled through the room, and Harrison folded his arms, smirking. Spaceships, huh? Leo grinned. Yeah. Everybody likes spaceships. If you sell them, people will buy them, and then you'll be super rich. Even more than now. Harrison shook his head, barely suppressing his laughter. You're thinking too small, kid. We should just buy NASA while we're at it. Leo's eyes widened. Oh, good idea. A burst of laughter erupted from the employees, and Harrison found himself enjoying this. He hadn't seen his staff so relaxed in a long time. Usually, the office ran on efficiency and intimidation. People respected him, sure. Feared him, probably. But laughed? That was new. And oddly refreshing. Just as he was about to cut the meeting short, his office phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw an incoming call from the front desk. Sir? Carol's voice came through, urgent but hesitant. There's a woman here asking for her son. She seems extremely upset. Harrison sighed, already knowing exactly who it was. Send her up. By the time he returned to his office, Sophie Carter was already there, arms crossed, looking absolutely livid. Where is my son? Harrison barely had time to register the wave of frustration and exhaustion radiating from her before Leo came bounding into the office behind him, completely unaware of the storm brewing in his mother's eyes. Mom! Leo beamed. Guess what? I got a job! Sophie's head whipped toward her son. You what? Harrison leaned against his desk, arms crossed, watching the exchange with mild amusement. He had dealt with aggressive investors, cutthroat competitors, and infuriating board meetings. But there was something uniquely terrifying about an angry mother. Mom, it's fine, Leo insisted. Mr. Wolf said I could be his business consultant for the day. I even had a meeting. Sophie turned her glare toward Harrison. You put my 7-year-old in a meeting? In my defense, he put himself in the meeting, Harrison said, completely unbothered. And to be fair, his cookie idea was solid. Sophie looked like she was about to explode. I don't even, Leo, we are leaving. Right now. But I haven't gotten paid yet, Leo protested. Harrison, against all common sense, found himself stepping in. He was just trying to help you, you know. Sophie turned her glare to him again. Oh, really? And you, a billionaire, thought the best way to help was to humor him instead of, I don't know, calling me? Harrison shrugged. He seemed very determined. Sophie pinched the bridge of her nose. I cannot believe this. Leo, sensing the situation slipping, tried one last tactic. But Mom, Mr. Wolf said you should take a day off. Sophie froze. Excuse me? Harrison straightened. He's right. You work too much. You deserve a break. I'll cover whatever you'd make in a shift, no strings attached. Sophie scoffed. Oh, that's rich. Literally. You think I'm going to take a handout from some billionaire who thinks this is all a joke? Harrison's jaw tightened. It's not a handout. It's a suggestion. And maybe an apology for letting your son run wild in my company all day. Sophie folded her arms. Not interested. Leo groaned. Mom! Leo, she said firmly, then turned back to Harrison. I appreciate whatever game you're playing here, but I don't take charity. Harrison studied her. Stubborn. Fiercely independent. Probably too proud for her own good. For the first time in a long time, he felt something that wasn't amusement or mild curiosity. It was frustration and respect. "Fine," he said. "But I meant what I said." Sophie didn't dignify that with a response. Instead, she took Leo's hand, muttering something about never letting him out of her sight again, and stormed out. Harrison exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Melanie peeked in again. "So, does this mean we're not buying spaceships?" Harrison sighed. "Shut up, Melanie." Harrison wasn't sure why Sophie Carter stuck in his mind. He dealt with plenty of difficult people before, board members, investors, even the occasional competitor who thought they could outmaneuver him. But something about her absolute refusal to accept his offer gnawed at him. Maybe it was her pride, that unyielding independence that reminded him of himself. Or maybe it was Leo, that kid with too much determination for his own good, standing in his oversized blazer and asking for a job like it was the most natural thing in the world. Either way, he found himself doing something uncharacteristic, taking an interest in someone else's life. The next morning, instead of heading to his usual high-rise office, Harrison found himself driving toward a part of the city he hadn't set foot in for years. The streets were narrower, the buildings older, but the sidewalks were alive with movement, people rushing to work, small businesses opening their doors for the day, the smell of fresh bread from a corner bakery mixing with the scent of a city that never truly rested. His sleek, black sports car looked completely out of place as he pulled up in front of the Bluebell Diner, a small, bustling restaurant squeezed between a laundromat and a hardware store. A bell jingled as he stepped inside. The place was packed, every table filled with early morning customers. A waitress hurried past him with a tray stacked high with plates, and the air buzzed with the sounds of clinking coffee cups and casual conversation. Harrison inhaled deeply, the scent of bacon and syrup oddly comforting, and made his way toward the counter. A teenage girl with a name tag reading Maddie approached, chewing gum like she had all the time in the world. "Take a seat anywhere, sir. Booths are full, though." Harrison glanced around and spotted an empty booth by the window. "Perfect." He slid into the seat, adjusting his cufflinks, only to hear a voice behind him. "Sir, that table's reserved." He turned to find an elderly man holding a newspaper, giving him a polite but firm look. Harrison blinked. "Reserved?" Maddie smirked. "Yeah. Old man Charlie's been sitting there every morning for 15 years. You can take that seat, but I guarantee you'll be fighting a 78-year-old over territory." Harrison sighed and moved to the counter instead, settling onto a bar stool. Maddie handed him a menu, though he barely glanced at it before looking up at her. "I'll take a latte," she snorted. "Buddy, this is a diner. We've got coffee. Black or with cream and sugar?" Harrison stared at her. "No espresso? No steamed milk?" Maddie gave him a look like he'd asked if they served lobster. "We've got coffee," she repeated. "Right. Of course." He sighed. "Black, then." As Maddie turned to pour his drink, Harrison reached into his wallet, grabbed the first bill he found, and placed it on the counter. A crisp $100 bill. Maddie turned back, saw the money, and let out a loud laugh. "Sir, what do you think this is, the Ritz? You got anything smaller?" Harrison frowned. "Just keep the change." Before Maddie could respond, another voice cut in, one he recognized instantly. "You've got to be kidding me." He turned, and there she was, Sophie Carter, standing behind the counter in a slightly faded blue apron, a towel slung over her shoulder, and an expression that could curdle milk. Harrison tilted his head. "Morning, Carter." Sophie put her hands on her hips. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Getting a coffee," he said casually, lifting the cup Maddie had just placed in front of him. "And so far learning just how much I take lattes for granted." She narrowed her eyes. "Try another answer." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "You don't seem like the type to take vacations. Figured I'd see for myself if Leo was exaggerating." Sophie's expression darkened. "You came all the way here just to check up on me?" He shrugged. "I was in the neighborhood." Her lips pressed into a thin line. No, you weren't. Alright, fine. He wasn't. But now that he was here, he might as well make good use of his time. He lifted his coffee to his lips, took a sip, and immediately regretted it. This is terrible, he muttered, setting it down. Maddie let out an amused snort. That's what happens when you drink fancy billionaire coffee every day. Sophie sighed, rubbing her temple like his presence was physically causing her a headache. Look, I don't know what your deal is, but I have work to do. So if you're done playing whatever game this is, you can, excuse me. A voice cut through the diner, and suddenly, Harrison found himself the unwilling center of attention as a middle-aged woman stormed up to the counter. Miss Carter, I'd like to know why this man is sitting in my booth. Harrison turned, confused, to find himself looking at an absolutely livid customer. Sophie sighed. Mrs. Dalton, I am so sorry, this is my booth. The woman insisted. I sit here every morning. Maddie leaned over the counter toward Harrison and muttered. Told you. People here don't play about their seats. Harrison stared at her, then at Mrs. Dalton, then at Sophie. Slowly, he stood. By all means. Mrs. Dalton huffed and slid into the booth with all the self-importance of a queen reclaiming her throne. Harrison shook his head. This place is something else. Sophie looked up at him, exasperated. Yes, it is. And I have work to do. So unless you're here to apply for a job, not today. Harrison cut in smoothly, watching her. He had expected to find her busy. He hadn't expected to find her this overworked. She moved at a pace that suggested exhaustion was her permanent state, taking orders, balancing trays, dodging customers without missing a step. Even as she spoke to him, she was wiping down a counter, refilling a coffee cup, motioning for Maddie to grab another plate. She wasn't just tired. She was drowning in responsibility. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, he didn't like it. He exhaled, reaching into his wallet and pulling out a wad of cash. Sophie's eyes immediately narrowed. Don't you dare. You won't take a break unless someone covers your wages, right? He placed the money on the counter. So let me cover them. Sophie grabbed the bills and shoved them back at him. I told you before, I don't take handouts. Harrison held her gaze. And I don't make offers twice. She stared at him for a long moment, something unreadable flashing across her face. Then she exhaled sharply, stuffing the money back into his hand. Then I guess we're both stubborn. With that, she turned, grabbed a pot of coffee, and walked away, leaving Harrison standing there, holding a fistful of rejected money and a bitter cup of diner coffee. He smirked. Interesting. Harrison should have let it go. He knew that. Any sane man would have walked out of that diner, chalked up Sophie Carter's stubbornness as an amusing but inconsequential encounter, and moved on with his life. He had companies to run, deals to negotiate, an empire to maintain. And yet 2 days later, he found himself pulling up in front of the Bluebell Diner once again, this time with a plan. It wasn't just about Sophie anymore, it was the principle of it. She was the first person in years who had looked at his money like it was worthless, like it didn't hold the power to fix everything. And for some absurd reason, he couldn't stop thinking about the way she moved through that diner, carrying exhaustion in her bones but refusing to let it slow her down. He wanted to know what made her so damn resistant, why she refused to let herself breathe. And maybe, just maybe, he liked the challenge. The morning rush had just settled when he walked in, hands in his pockets, scanning the diner for her. Sophie was behind the counter, flipping through an order pad, her hair hastily pulled into a ponytail. She hadn't noticed him yet. He let a smirk tug at the corner of his mouth. This was going to be fun. He strode up to the counter and casually leaned on it. Carter! Sophie's head snapped up, and the moment she saw him, she groaned. Oh, you again! Do billionaires not have better things to do? Harrison grinned. We multitask. She exhaled sharply, setting down her order pad. If you came here to offer me money again, don't waste your breath. Not money, he said smoothly. A deal. Sophie narrowed her eyes. Not interested. You haven't even heard it yet. I don't need to. Harrison chuckled, shaking his head. You really don't make things easy, do you? He reached into his pocket, pulled out a neatly folded check, and slid it across the counter. 1 week. Full pay. No strings attached. Sophie barely glanced at it before shoving it back at him. Try again. You didn't let me finish, he said, smirking. I'll cover your wages for a week if you agree to have dinner with me. Sophie froze. For the first time since he met her, she seemed caught off guard, lips parting slightly as she processed his words. Then she blinked, eyes narrowing into a glare. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. Not at all, Harrison said smoothly. 1 dinner. That's the deal. Sophie scoffed. And why on earth would I do that? Harrison shrugged. Because I don't lose bets, and you clearly need a break. Consider it a business transaction. You take the time off, and in exchange, I get an evening of your company. Sophie let out a short, humorless laugh. Unbelievable. You really think I'd go on a pity date with you? Harrison raised an eyebrow. Who said anything about pity? Sophie folded her arms. Not happening. Just then, before Harrison could argue further, Leo came bounding in from the kitchen, where Maddie had been sneaking him extra pancakes. Mr. Wolf, he said excitedly, then spotted the check on the counter. Whoa, what's that? Sophie quickly snatched it up, but Harrison smirked. It's a deal I offered your mom. 1 week of paid time off in exchange for dinner with me. Leo's eyes widened. Then, to Harrison's utter delight, he spun to his mother with a look of pure betrayal. Mom, are you serious? Why would you say no? Sophie groaned. Leo, Mom, you never do anything fun. Leo insisted, crossing his arms. You work all the time. This is perfect. You get a break, and free food. Sophie's eye twitched. I am not discussing this with my 7-year-old. Why not? Leo shot back. I got you into this mess, so technically, I should have a say. Harrison chuckled. I like the way this kid thinks. Sophie shot him a look that could kill. Then she turned back to Leo. I don't want a break, Leo. And I definitely don't want to go on a dinner date with Mr. Moneybags over here. Leo huffed. Mom, please. Just one time? He looked up at her with wide, pleading eyes, the same look, Harrison imagined, that had convinced her to let him apply for a job in the first place. I promise I won't ask for anything else for a whole month. Sophie groaned, rubbing her forehead. Leo, come on, Carter. Harrison interjected, enjoying this far too much. Think of it as a negotiation. I help you, you tolerate me for a couple of hours. Simple. Sophie let out a long, suffering sigh. You two are impossible. Does that mean yes? Leo asked eagerly. She pinched the bridge of her nose. Fine. Fine. But 1 dinner. And it's not a date. It's a business transaction. Harrison finished for her, smirking. Sophie pointed a finger at him. And don't think for a second that this means I like you. Harrison grinned. Wouldn't dream of it. Leo pumped his fist. Yes. This is gonna be awesome. Sophie muttered something under her breath that sounded a lot like I am going to regret this so much. But Harrison didn't care. He had won. This was going to be very interesting. Sophie spent the entire day leading up to the so-called business transaction, trying to convince herself it was just dinner. Just a meal. Just an obligation she'd endure to get Harrison Wolf off her back. It wasn't a date. Definitely not a date. Still, when she caught herself standing in front of the mirror, smoothing down her dress and second-guessing her choice of shoes, she scowled at her own reflection. Ridiculous. She was doing this for Leo, not because some insufferable billionaire had managed to get under her skin. A sharp knock at the door made her heart jump. She exhaled, squared her shoulders, and opened it, only to blink in confusion. Harrison wasn't dressed in one of his usual perfectly tailored suits. Instead, he wore dark jeans, a casual button-up with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and was that a leather jacket? She arched a brow. Are we robbing a bank? Harrison smirked. Tempting, but no. You'll see. Sophie narrowed her eyes but followed him outside, where a sleek black car was parked by the curb. As expected. But when Harrison opened the door for her, she realized something else was unexpected, the route they were taking. She frowned as they passed upscale restaurants, exclusive lounges, and Michelin-starred establishments. Where exactly are we going? You'll see, he repeated, eyes twinkling with amusement. Sophie huffed and crossed her arms, but when Harrison finally pulled into a parking lot, she stared in shock. A carnival. Bright lights, neon signs, the scent of fried food in the air, the distant sound of a carousel chiming a tune, nothing even remotely resembling the stiff, pretentious dinner she'd been dreading. She turned to him, dumbfounded. Seriously? Harrison grinned. What? Not fancy enough for you? Sophie let out a dry laugh. I thought you'd take me to some overpriced restaurant where they serve tiny portions on giant plates. Yeah, well, shocking revelation, I eat normal food too. He stepped out of the car and walked around to open her door. Come on, Carter. Let's make this tolerable. Still suspicious but undeniably curious, Sophie followed him inside. It started off harmless enough. They walked through the flashing lights and noisy crowds, Sophie watching in amusement as Harrison scanned the booths like he was analyzing stock market trends. When they reached the ring toss, he smirked. Watch and learn, he said, rolling up his sleeves. Sophie crossed her arms, unimpressed. Oh, this is gonna be good. He tossed the first ring. Missed. He frowned, adjusting his stance. Second ring. Missed. By the time he'd missed the third, Sophie was laughing, actual, unfiltered laughter she hadn't let out in a long time. Oh my God, Mr. Billionaire, I thought you were supposed to be good at everything. Harrison scowled. This game is rigged. Uh-huh. Sure it is. Determined to redeem himself, he stepped aside, arms crossed. All right, show me how it's done then. Sophie grabbed a ring, aimed, and with infuriating ease, landed it perfectly on the bottle. Harrison stared. You're kidding. She smirked. Not bad for someone who actually had a childhood. Harrison scoffed but handed her a stuffed bear from the prize shelf. Fine. Beginner's luck. What followed was war. The night turned into a series of escalating challenges. Sophie wiped the floor with him at the basketball hoops, Harrison annihilated her at the high striker, she won at the water gun race, and then he cheated during the balloon dart game by bribing the vendor to let him stand 2 feet closer. At some point, they got cotton candy, which Harrison had never actually eaten before. What do you mean it just disappears in your mouth? And Sophie, watching his very genuine reaction, had to look away to keep herself from smiling too much. She hadn't expected this. Any of this. She hadn't expected Harrison Wolfe to be competitive over rigged carnival games. She hadn't expected him to actually laugh, to make dumb bets, to be so genuinely terrible at skee-ball. And she definitely hadn't expected to enjoy herself. Somewhere between him loudly demanding a refund for the basketball game. It's physically impossible for a hoop to be that small. And her nearly falling over laughing at his failure to pop a single balloon, she forgot this was supposed to be an obligation. For the first time in a long time, she felt light. As the night slowed, they found themselves on the Ferris wheel, a bag of popcorn between them. The lights of the city stretched out in the distance, and for a moment, the carnival noise faded. Sophie sighed, leaning back. All right, I'll admit it. This wasn't the worst night of my life. Harrison smirked. High praise. I'm honored. She shook her head, then eyed him. Why did you really do this? Harrison's smirk faltered slightly. He hesitated, then exhaled. Because I wanted to. Sophie tilted her head, waiting. He ran a hand through his hair, gaze drifting toward the city lights. When I was a kid, we couldn't afford places like this. My mom worked 2 jobs. My dad was gone. And then, when I finally could afford things like this, I was too busy chasing success to stop and enjoy them. He exhaled. I guess I wanted to see if I'd missed out. Sophie watched him carefully, something shifting in her chest. "Anne?" Harrison glanced at her. "I think I did." The weight of those words hung between them, heavier than she expected. Sophie swallowed. She wasn't supposed to like him. He was arrogant, impossible, rich. She had spent her whole life scraping by, and men like him weren't part of her world. But right now, he wasn't acting like a billionaire. He was just a guy, sitting next to her, admitting things he probably didn't tell anyone else. And for the first time, Sophie saw him. Not the CEO. Not the billionaire. Just Harrison. She shook her head, glancing away. "Well, at least you finally know how to have fun. Took you long enough." Harrison chuckled. "I had a good teacher." The Ferris wheel came to a stop. Neither of them moved right away. Then Harrison smirked. "By the way, I'm counting this as a win." Sophie arched a brow. "How? I got you to admit you had fun." She rolled her eyes but smiled. "You're impossible. And yet here you are." Sophie groaned. "Do not make me regret this." But she didn't. And somehow, she knew he knew that too. They stepped off the Ferris wheel, still caught in the odd hush that comes after sharing a vulnerable moment. As they walked through the carnival lights, neither of them spoke much, but there was a softness in the air between them, a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed. Harrison never considered himself the type to change for anyone. He had built his life around control, controlling his business, his image, and most of all, his emotions. But somehow, without him even realizing it, Sophie Carter and her precocious son had slipped past all of his defenses. It started subtly. Instead of rushing out of meetings the moment they ended, he found himself lingering in the office, considering whether Leo would approve of the latest snack offerings in the break room. Instead of dismissing employee birthday celebrations as unnecessary distractions, he now found himself sitting through entire gatherings, nodding along as cupcakes were passed around. And worst of all, he caught himself looking forward to Sophie's texts, often short, sometimes sarcastic, but always with that underlying warmth she tried so hard to hide. Even his employees noticed. Melanie, his assistant, had raised an eyebrow when he asked her to make sure Leo always had an open invitation to visit. Carol, the receptionist, had smirked when she saw him smiling, at a text Sophie had sent about Leo's latest scheme to train their neighbor's cat to fetch. Of course, Harrison wasn't blind. He knew exactly what was happening. He was letting them in, whether he wanted to or not. And for the first time in his life, he didn't hate it. That should have been his first warning. The second came on a Thursday evening when Sophie met him outside the diner after her shift, arms crossed, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Leo's been asking if he can come see your office again," she said, shifting on her feet. "And against my better judgment, I might be okay with it." Harrison leaned against his car, smirking. "Might? Don't push it, Wolf." But there was a teasing glint in her eye, and for the first time, Harrison allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, this thing between them wasn't impossible. And then it all fell apart. It started with a phone call. A casual, routine check-in from one of his development executives. "Sir, just confirming that the acquisition paperwork for the Lincoln Square project is being finalized. That diner on the corner, the Bluebell, I think, is the last holdout, but I assume we'll be moving forward soon?" Harrison froze. The Lincoln Square project. The real estate development deal he had set in motion months ago. The one that included plans to buy out the entire block, including Sophie's diner. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "Sir? Put everything on hold," he said quickly. "No further action until I say so." There was a pause. "Understood." Harrison hung up, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He needed to fix this, immediately. But he was already too late. Sophie found out before he could tell her. He didn't know how. Maybe one of the other employees had overheard something. Maybe an article about the project had resurfaced. Maybe someone had connected the dots and brought it to her attention. All he knew was that when he showed up at the diner the next evening, expecting their usual banter, She was waiting for him outside, arms crossed, fury burning in her eyes. You were going to buy out the diner? Harrison opened his mouth, but she didn't let him speak. This whole time, she went on, voice shaking. You were just waiting for the right moment to swoop in and take the only thing keeping me and half the people who work here afloat? Sophie, it's not like that. Then what is it like? Her voice rose. Because it sure as hell feels like I was played. Harrison took a step forward, but she took one back, putting distance between them. And for the first time in years, he felt helpless. I didn't know, he said, more earnestly than he had ever spoken before. I started that deal months ago, long before I met you. And yet, in all the time we've spent together, you never thought to mention it. He exhaled sharply. I didn't know how. Sophie laughed, short, bitter. Right. Because explaining that you were planning to bulldoze my job isn't exactly great first date conversation, is it? Harrison clenched his jaw. I called off the acquisition. I don't care. That stopped him. He had expected resistance. He hadn't expected that. Sophie took a breath, steadying herself, but her voice was still thick with anger. You think you can just fix everything with money? Buy the diner, cancel a deal, throw some cash at a problem and it'll go away. But it doesn't work like that, Harrison. He swallowed hard. I never wanted to hurt you. She shook her head, looking away, as if she couldn't even stand to meet his eyes. I let you in. Leo let you in. And now I have to explain to him why he's never seeing you again. That hit him harder than anything else. He took a step forward. Sophie, don't. She exhaled, then turned on her heel. This was a mistake. Harrison stood there, watching her disappear into the diner, his hands clenched at his sides, completely at a loss. For the first time in his life, he had no idea how to fix this. Harrison had always believed that every problem had a solution. Business was about strategy, about control, about knowing when to push and when to retreat. But nothing in his meticulously built world had prepared him for Sophie Carter. For days, he replayed their last conversation over and over in his head, trying to pinpoint where exactly it had all gone wrong. The betrayal in her voice, the way she had looked at him like she didn't recognize him anymore, it gnawed at him in a way he couldn't shake. And Leo. The kid had been silent, distant. The usual bright energy had dimmed, and that, more than anything, unsettled Harrison. So, like the businessman he was, he decided to fix it the only way he knew how. He bought the diner. It was an easy transaction. A few phone calls, a number that made the previous owner eager to sign, and just like that, the Bluebell Diner belonged to him. But he wasn't keeping it. No, this wasn't an acquisition, it was a gift. Harrison had it all planned out. He would walk into that diner, hand Sophie the deed, and prove to her that this wasn't about power or business. It was about her. About Leo. About something he couldn't quite put into words yet, but knew he wasn't ready to lose. The moment he walked through the diner doors, all conversations halted. Employees froze, customers turned, and Sophie, standing behind the counter, refilling a coffee cup, locked eyes with him. He had expected hostility. What he hadn't expected was the exhaustion in her face, the deep weariness that made something twist in his chest. He strode toward the counter, slipping the envelope from his coat pocket and setting it down in front of her. It's yours. Sophie frowned. What? The diner, he said evenly. I bought it. And now I'm giving it to you. Silence. A long, deafening silence. Then Sophie let out a breath. Slow. Disbelieving. And then, to his absolute horror, she laughed. It wasn't a pleasant laugh. It was bitter, incredulous, the kind of laugh that sent ice trickling down his spine. You. She shook her head, gripping the edge of the counter. You bought the diner. Yes, Harrison said, feeling like the ground beneath him was suddenly unstable. You don't have to worry anymore. No one can take this place away from you. It's yours, Sophie. No strings, no conditions. Just no. The word landed like a slap. Harrison blinked. What? I said no, Sophie repeated, pushing the envelope back toward him. Take it back. Harrison frowned. Sophie, I don't think you understand. No, you don't understand. Her voice rose, cutting through the air like a knife. You can't just throw money at a problem and expect it to disappear. He clenched his jaw. That's not what I'm doing. Isn't it? Sophie's hands curled into fists. You think this fixes everything? That you can just swoop in like some rich savior and solve all my problems with a check? Harrison stiffened. He had expected gratitude. Maybe even relief. But not this. I was trying to help, he said, voice dangerously low. I never asked for your help. Sophie shot back. A thick, unbearable tension stretched between them. Then, from the side, a small voice. Mom? They both turned to see Leo standing near the entrance, wide-eyed, his small hands gripping the straps of his backpack. Sophie inhaled sharply, her anger faltering. But Leo wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Harrison. You bought the diner? Leo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harrison swallowed. Yeah, kid. I did. Leo's face twisted in confusion. But that's a good thing. Right, Mom? Sophie shut her eyes for a second before crouching down to her son's level. Leo, sweetie, it's not that simple. Leo's small brows knitted together. But why? Mr. Wolf is trying to help. Isn't that what we wanted? Sophie exhaled, rubbing her forehead. It's not about help, Leo. It's about what it means. I don't want someone else swooping in and fixing my life like I can't do it myself. But he cares. Leo's voice cracked, frustration clear in his young face. Why can't you just say thank you? Sophie's face softened, her expression torn, but Harrison could see the pain in her eyes. And that's when it hit him. He had lost. Not in the way he was used to losing, not in negotiations or financial battles. No, this loss was personal. Because Leo was upset. Because Sophie looked hurt. Because he had done everything wrong. Harrison took a slow step back. He looked at Sophie, at the anger still simmering beneath the exhaustion, at the way she was trying to find the right words for her son. Then he looked at Leo, at the hope that had been snuffed out too soon. And for the first time in his life, Harrison realized that money wasn't the answer. He picked up the envelope. He didn't say anything. Didn't argue. Just gave them one last look, turned, and walked out. The cold air hit him as he stepped outside, but it wasn't the wind that made his chest feel hollow. It was the weight of losing them both. And he had no one to blame but himself. Harrison had never been the type to dwell on failure. If something didn't work, he analyzed, adjusted, and moved on. That was how he built his empire, how he stayed at the top. But this, losing Sophie and Leo, was different. For the first time in years, he didn't know how to fix what he had broken. The logical part of him wanted to go back to the way things were, to bury himself in work, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But logic had no place in the mess he had made. Because the truth was, he missed them. He missed Leo's ridiculous ideas and his relentless enthusiasm. He missed Sophie's sharp comebacks, the way she challenged him, the way she saw through the carefully constructed persona he had built over the years. And most of all, he hated knowing that he had made them unhappy. Which meant he couldn't walk away. Not this time. The first thing he did was call off the entire Lincoln Square development project. He could have just removed the diner from the acquisition, but that wasn't enough. He didn't want Sophie to think he was saving her. He wanted her to know she was capable of saving herself. So, in an unprecedented move, he shut it all down. No buyouts, no renovations, no luxury high-rises replacing local businesses. He issued a statement ensuring that all existing stores, including the Bluebell, were staying exactly where they were. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't something he gave her. It was something she had fought for, and this time, he was stepping aside and letting her win. But he wasn't done. A week passed before he walked into the Bluebell again. This time, he didn't stride in like he owned the place. He didn't come bearing deals or solutions. He came as a customer. The diner was busy, the usual morning crowd filling the booths. Sophie was behind the counter, moving between customers, pouring coffee, balancing plates with that effortless efficiency that had always impressed him. When she finally looked up and saw him, she froze. Harrison didn't say anything. He just slid into a stool at the counter, folded his hands, and waited. For a long moment, she just stared at him, wary and unreadable. Then, with a sigh that was equal parts exasperation and amusement, she grabbed a coffee pot and walked over. "Black, right?" she muttered, filling a cup and sliding it in front of him. Harrison smirked. "You remembered. You complained enough last time." He chuckled, then hesitated. "How's Leo?" Sophie glanced at him, then exhaled. "He was upset," she admitted. "Still is. He doesn't understand why we stopped seeing you." Harrison swallowed. "I never meant to hurt him." "I know," Sophie said softly, then fixed him with a pointed look. "But you still did." Harrison nodded, accepting that. For a while, they didn't speak. The diner bustled around them, but for once, he was content to just be there. He came back the next day. And the next. And the next. Always at the counter. Always ordering the same coffee, even though it was terrible. And little by little, Sophie stopped looking at him like he was an unwelcome presence. She still rolled her eyes when he smirked at her. She still called him Mr. Moneybags under her breath. But something had shifted. Then one morning, just as he was finishing his coffee, a familiar voice rang out. "You're back, Leo." Before Harrison could react, the kid launched himself at him. "Whoa," Harrison said, steadying himself as Leo practically tackled him in excitement. "Mom said you weren't coming back," Leo said, grinning up at him. "But I knew she was wrong. I knew you liked us too much." Sophie groaned from behind the counter. "Leo." "It's fine," Harrison said, still stunned by the relief in Leo's face. Leo beamed. "I have so much to tell you." "Oh. And guess what? My mom finally took a day off." Harrison raised a brow, glancing at Sophie. "Oh?" Sophie sighed, shaking her head. "Don't start." Leo grinned. "Maddie and the others covered her shift. She didn't want to, but I told her she had to because even superheroes need breaks. And you know what? She actually relaxed." Harrison smirked. "Well, technically, I did get your mom a job." Sophie narrowed her eyes. "Don't." Leo blinked. "Huh?" Harrison leaned in slightly. "She just doesn't know it yet." Leo gasped, laughing. Sophie rolled her eyes, but there was something softer in her expression. For the first time in a long time, they all belonged somewhere. And Harrison Wolfe, billionaire, businessman, control freak, finally understood what happiness really meant. Harrison never planned on being anyone's dad. He'd built his life, and his empire, on a simple premise: success comes first, emotion second. But the day Sophie Carter and her son, Leo, walked into his world, everything he thought he knew began to shift. Their first encounters were rocky, even comical at times. Leo barged into Harrison's office, asking for a job so he could buy his mom a day off. Sophie, fiercely independent and skeptical of anyone who flashed money around, wanted nothing to do with the billionaire who seemed to solve everything with his checkbook. And Harrison, used to people bending to his will, found himself baffled by a woman who simply refused to be bought. Little by little, though, each saw beyond the surface. When Harrison visited Sophie at the diner, initially to assess whether Leo's story was true, he saw, firsthand, how tirelessly she worked. She wasn't just proud, she was driven by love for her son, doing everything in her power to provide a stable life. Harrison, who had grown up with very little himself, recognized that fierce determination and realized he respected her for it, more than he'd ever respected most of the cutthroat executives he dealt with daily. And Leo, who simply wanted his mom to be happy, latched on to Harrison with that same unshakable determination, believing the billionaire could help in ways he himself couldn't. From there, An odd sort of friendship formed, though both Harrison and Sophie would have scoffed at the word friendship in the early stages. Harrison brought Leo into his office as an intern, humoring the boy's wild ideas about cookies and spaceships, only to discover that Leo's enthusiasm was contagious. His own employees started smiling more. Sophie resisted every attempt Harrison made to ease her burdens, but she couldn't deny the growing warmth she felt when he showed up at the diner just to see her. Every act of stubbornness on her part only seemed to fuel his curiosity, and behind all the arguments and sarcastic jabs lay an undeniable spark. It wasn't just Sophie who changed Harrison. Leo's unwavering faith in him, the idea that a powerful man could still choose to be kind, seeped into places Harrison had long closed off. For the first time, he found himself looking forward to spending time with a child who wasn't related to him, laughing over silly carnival games, or quietly listening to Leo chatter about his day at school. The boy's earnestness peeled back Harrison's defenses in a way no business negotiation ever could. In the quiet moments, Harrison found himself wanting to be someone Leo could rely on, not just a passing figure in his life. Sophie, too, found her carefully constructed walls slipping. At first, she was convinced that Harrison's interest was fleeting, that he'd grow bored or frustrated and move on to something new. But his persistence surprised her. Whenever she pushed him away, he showed up again, not with lavish gifts or checks, but with honest concern. Instead of trying to fix her problems, he started asking about her dreams, about the people in the neighborhood who relied on the diner, about what made her fight so hard to keep going. Slowly, she realized that behind the billionaire bravado was someone who understood struggle more intimately than she'd imagined. He, too, had once known what it felt like to have nothing. They didn't fall into family life overnight. There were arguments, lots of them. Sometimes about big things, like Harrison's attempt to buy the diner as a grand gesture, and sometimes about the smallest details, like which cereal Leo should eat for breakfast or whether Harrison's high-tech coffee machine was overkill. But each argument, each bump in the road, forced them to communicate. And with every tense conversation, they learned more about what it meant to truly care for someone beyond business, beyond pride. Leo was the glue that held them together during their toughest moments. He'd slip into Harrison's office, wearing a determined expression, and remind him, "You have to apologize to Mom for being dumb, okay?" Then he'd head home and tell Sophie, "Mr. Wolf's not really bad, he just doesn't know how to show people he cares." The child's unshakable belief in their potential as a unit bridged gaps that otherwise might have stayed too wide. Eventually, they reached a place where Harrison no longer felt the need to control everything. He called off the development project that threatened the diner, not to impress Sophie, but because he recognized that the place mattered to her and the community. He visited as a regular customer, endured the terrible coffee, tipped the staff generously, but not so much as to offend Sophie, and showed up for Leo's Little League games. Sophie, for her part, let him sit in on family movie nights, allowed herself to lean on him when work became too exhausting, and opened up about her hopes and fears. Their lives entwined so naturally that even the diner's regulars started asking, "So when are you two finally going to get serious?" It happened one late night, long after the diner's closing time. Sophie and Harrison were tidying up, working side by side in comfortable silence, while Leo drifted off in a corner booth. Every once in a while, their eyes met, and there was a tenderness there, recognition of how far they'd come. A pile of paperwork sat on the counter, bills and receipts from a long day. Sophie sighed, wiping her brow, and Harrison gently moved the papers aside so she could rest. "I've got it," he said softly. No grand tone, no bossy air, just an offer. Sophie paused, her gaze lingering on him. She saw the man who had gone from being an arrogant CEO to someone who genuinely cared, who chose to show up for her and Leo each day. In that moment, the final wall she'd built around her heart cracked. They kissed for the first time that night, a simple, gentle kiss that confirmed everything Leo had suspected. From there, building a family didn't require an official announcement. It was simply the life they fell into with each passing day. Leo started calling him Dad more frequently, testing it out shyly at first until it felt natural. Sophie began trusting Harrison not just with her diner's future, but with her deepest worries and her greatest hopes. The proposal came months later, prompted by neither crisis nor argument. It was just another closing time, the three of them sharing a milkshake as they locked up the diner. Leo had nodded off in the booth again, and Sophie was smiling at Harrison, a smile that made him realize he never wanted to see her look at anyone else that way. He slid a simple, elegant ring from his pocket, pressed it into her hand, and whispered, "Will you marry me?" Sophie's eyes brimmed with tears, happy tears. She didn't need to say much. She just pressed her forehead to his and murmured, "Yes," letting her lips brush his in a soft, grateful kiss. Leo woke up halfway through the moment, blinking groggily, and immediately caught on. He let out a whoop so loud that half the staff, who had already gone home, would have heard if they'd still been around. Harrison and Sophie just laughed, arms around each other, the ring glinting under the diner's fluorescent lights as though it was something far more precious than diamonds or gold. From that day forward, they navigated life as a family, an unconventional one, perhaps, but one bound by love that had been forged through trials and mutual respect. Sophie accepted help without feeling ashamed, and Harrison learned that real strength sometimes meant letting someone else lead. Leo got the father he'd always dreamed of, and the mother he adored finally found the peace and happiness she deserved. There were still disagreements, tears, and the occasional stubborn standoff, but they faced every challenge together, certain that nothing could tear them apart now. And in a quiet moment, after locking the diner and shutting off the neon sign, Sophie leaned her head on Harrison's shoulder, gazed at Leo bouncing excitedly by the door, and realized that this man, once a stranger, once an adversary, was now her partner in every sense of the word. They had formed a home that felt real, built on trust, laughter, and the relentless optimism of a child who believed anything was possible. For Harrison, it was more than a happy ending. It was a new beginning, a life he never expected to want but couldn't imagine living without. And every morning, as they unlocked the doors to that little diner and faced the day ahead, he felt profoundly grateful that sometimes, the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one. I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.